I told you, Mr. Monroe. Time's up. She's buried. You can't be here any longer.
She's here. I can't leave her alone.
Police tased a grieving veteran. 7 minutes later, the Marines arrived. When Officer Derek Bradley tased 72-year-old Marine Frank Monroe for refusing to leave Arlington Cemetery after hours, he didn't know Frank had buried his wife that morning or that Marines were already watching. October twilight painted Arlington National Cemetery in shades of gold and shadow as closing time approached. The sacred 639 acres held over 400,000 souls beneath white marble headstones that stretched like fallen dominoes across rolling hills where America's finest found eternal rest. At 5:15 p.m., groundskeepers prepared for evening lockdown while security began final sweeps through sections where grieving families often lingered, unable to say goodbye to dreams buried in hallowed ground. Frank Monroe knelt beside fresh earth in Section 60, his 72-year-old frame folded over the grave that had swallowed his heart, along with Evelyn's casket that morning. 48 years of marriage reduced to a rectangle of disturbed soil marked by temporary placard. Evelyn Sarah Monroe, beloved wife of Marine Gunnery Sergeant Franklin J. Monroe. His weathered hands scarred from caisson shrapnel, gentle from decades of holding Evelyn's traced invisible letters in the dirt. The Purple Heart and Bronze Star ribbons on his dress blues meant nothing now. Evelyn had been his only medal that mattered. Her final whisper echoed through memory. "I'll wait for you at Heaven's Gate, my Marine." In his coat pocket lay her wedding ring, still warm from her finger this morning when the funeral director had asked if he wanted to keep it. Frank couldn't bear to part with that circle of gold that had bound them since 1976, when she'd married a young sergeant fresh from Vietnam nightmares that she'd helped heal through patient love. Some battles you fight for country, others for love, but the hardest battles you fight alone in the dark. "Sir, cemetery's closed. Time to go." Arlington Cemetery Police Officer Derek Bradley approached with routine authority, unaware he was about to make the worst decision of his 15-year career. His tone carried no recognition of grief, no understanding that some farewells couldn't be scheduled around posted visiting hours. Frank didn't move from Evelyn's grave. "Need a few more minutes, officer? Buried my wife this morning." Bradley had been having the worst week of his life. Divorce papers served Monday, custody battle Wednesday, now overtime on Friday because 2 officers called in sick. His ex-wife's lawyer had made it clear any sign of professional instability would cost him weekends with his daughter Sophie. "Sir, regulations are regulations. Cemetery closes at 5 p.m. sharp." Bradley's voice carried exhaustion that had nothing to do with the job. "I don't make exceptions." "She was afraid of the dark," Frank whispered, his words barely audible. "Never spent a night alone in 48 years. Can't start tonight." The vulnerability in that admission should have moved Bradley, but 15 years of police work, 5 years of marriage falling apart, had armor-plated his heart against emotional appeals that reminded him of his own losses. "Sir, personal problems don't override federal property regulations. Leave now or face arrest." Frank's hand pressed against cold earth. "Officer, I got nowhere else to go. She was my home." Those words hit too close to Bradley's own truth, the empty apartment waiting for him, the silence that echoed with memories of Sophie's laughter before the divorce destroyed everything he'd cared about. "Then you're trespassing," Bradley said, reaching for handcuffs with mechanical precision that masked his own pain. Bradley's training had taught him that compassion was weakness, that exceptions created problems his superiors would blame on him personally. His supervisor, Captain Reynolds, had been clear. Zero tolerance for after-hours violations. Cemetery security depends on consistent enforcement. But Frank recognized something familiar in Bradley's rigid stance, the defensive posture of a man fighting his own battles while maintaining professional facade that protected him from additional pain. "Officer, what's your first name?" Frank asked quietly. "Derek." "Why?" Bradley replied, surprised by the personal question that cut through procedural distance. "Derek, I can see you're hurting about something, but taking it out on grieving widower won't fix whatever's broken in your life." The observation stung because it was accurate. Bradley's personal pain was bleeding into professional decisions, his need for control manifesting as inflexibility that served no one's interests. "Sir, I don't need relationship advice from trespassers," Bradley snapped, his anger revealing the wound Frank had touched. "Son, I'm not trying to counsel you, just asking for human decency on day I buried woman who taught me what love means." 20 yards away, Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams finished placing flowers on his squad leader's grave, the man who died saving Marcus's life in Fallujah. He turned toward his car when he heard a familiar voice that made his heart skip. "Gunny Monroe," Marcus whispered, recognizing his old drill instructor despite the years. Frank looked up, his tear-stained face brightening with recognition. "Marcus? Jesus, look at you, Staff Sergeant now." "Gunny taught me everything about being a Marine," Marcus said, approaching with respect that transcended rank. "What's happening here?" Bradley felt outnumbered, but couldn't show weakness that might be reported to superiors who were already questioning his judgment since the divorce proceedings began affecting his work performance. "Federal trespassing violation. Both of you need to leave immediately," Bradley announced, drawing his taser with theatrical authority designed to regain control of situations spiraling beyond his comfort zone. "Officer, this is Gunnery Sergeant Frank Monroe," Marcus said with quiet intensity. "He trained half the Marines in this cemetery. Show some respect." But Bradley's personal pain had metastasized into professional rigidity. Respect for regulations. Comply or face consequences. Frank stood slowly, his dignity intact despite obvious physical frailty. "Derek, do what you need to do. I'm staying with Evelyn." The electrical shock dropped Frank across his wife's grave as Marcus screamed into his phone. All Marines, Gunny Monroe down at Arlington Section 60. They tased our drill instructor. Emergency response now." Sometimes love requires dying on the hill that holds your heart. Frank's collapse sent Marcus into combat mode, immediately beginning CPR while his emergency alert reached Marines across the D.C. area through networks that connected active duty, reserves, and veterans whose bonds transcended service dates. "Pulse weak, breathing shallow," Marcus reported, while working to stabilize Frank's cardiac rhythm disrupted by electrical shock. "Gunny trained thousands of us over 30 years. This is our fault for not being here sooner." Bradley stared at Frank's motionless form, processing catastrophic implications of tasing 72-year-old veteran on his wife's burial day. His personal problems had just become professional nightmare, requiring explanation to superiors who were already questioning his emotional stability. "I didn't know he was important," Bradley stammered, watching Marcus perform battlefield medicine on elderly man whose military bearing should have commanded respect rather than electrical assault. "Every Marine is important," Marcus replied with controlled fury. "But Gunny Monroe is Legend Bronze Star, Purple Heart, 30 years training young Americans to survive combat that would have killed them without his lessons." Within minutes, Marine vehicles began arriving from Quantico, Henderson Hall, Pentagon, and veteran groups whose members had been shaped by Frank's instruction during decades of service that had prepared them for battles they'd survived because of his training. But bureaucratic obstacles immediately emerged as Arlington Cemetery Administration and Arlington County Police arrived with jurisdictional concerns about unauthorized gathering on federal property that required permits for large assemblies. "This is unauthorized assembly on federal property," announced Cemetery Director Patricia Williams. "All non-essential personnel must disperse immediately." Colonel Sarah Harrison, arriving from Pentagon, faced institutional conflict between Marine loyalty to fallen instructor and federal regulations that prohibited large gatherings without proper authorization that could take weeks to obtain. "Director Williams, we're providing medical support to veteran who was assaulted during lawful cemetery visitation," Harrison replied diplomatically while coordinating with arriving Marines who were establishing protective perimeter around Frank despite bureaucratic objections. "Colonel, federal regulations require permits for assemblies exceeding 50 people. You have 30 Marines here already, with more arriving every minute," Williams countered, creating standoff between institutional loyalty and federal compliance. Bradley watched his career-ending mistake escalate into federal incident, requiring explanation to supervisors, media, and congressional representatives who would question why cemetery police were tasing grieving veterans during burial day visitations. Arlington County Police Chief Roberto Martinez arrived to find jurisdiction dispute between federal property, military personnel, and local authority that his officers couldn't resolve through standard procedures. "Chief Martinez, we need medical helicopter for cardiac emergency," Harrison requested, while Frank remained unconscious despite Marcus's efforts to stabilize his heart rhythm disrupted by electrical trauma. "Colonel, airspace restrictions require federal clearance that takes minimum 2 hours," Martinez replied, highlighting bureaucratic obstacles that could cost Frank his life, while institutional procedures prioritized compliance over medical emergencies. "Then we improvise," Harrison decided, authorizing Marine medical transport that violated federal procedures but served human necessity that regulations hadn't anticipated. Bradley realized his personal problems had created institutional crisis, requiring congressional investigation, media scrutiny, and federal review of cemetery policies that enabled assault on grieving veterans during emotional family visits. "Officer Bradley, explain your decision to use electrical force against elderly veteran visiting his wife's grave," demanded Chief Martinez, while processing subordinate's career-ending assault on military hero, whose reputation was legendary throughout Corps. "Chief, he refused lawful orders to vacate federal property after closing hours," Bradley replied weakly, his justification crumbling under scrutiny of superior officers who recognized catastrophic error in judgment. Frank's hospitalization generated media attention as social networks exploded with cell phone videos of Marines protecting grieving veteran from additional police harassment during medical emergency created by bureaucratic inflexibility. Frank's cardiac condition required specialized treatment at Walter Reed Medical Center, while Marines maintained honor guard at Evelyn's grave, ensuring she wouldn't be alone during his absence for medical care necessitated by electrical assault. Mr. Monroe is experiencing cardiac arrhythmia consistent with electrical shock trauma in elderly patient. Dr. Patricia Chen reported to Marine leadership, who'd assumed responsibility for their instructor's medical care. Bradley faced federal charges for assault on veteran, while his personal problems, divorce, custody battle, financial stress, were revealed during internal affairs investigation that exposed emotional instability affecting professional judgment. Derek, your personal issues don't justify tasing grieving veterans, observed police psychologist during mandatory evaluation. This incident suggests need for immediate counseling before any return to duty. Congressional representatives demanded hearings about cemetery security training that enabled assault on elderly Marine whose service had earned institutional protection rather than individual persecution by officers whose personal problems affected professional decisions. Senator Patricia Williams announced legislation establishing special provisions for grieving military families, while requiring comprehensive training for cemetery personnel about veteran recognition and grief counseling that prevented future assaults. When personal pain meets professional power, innocent people pay the price for battles that aren't theirs to fight. Frank's recovery was complicated by revelation that Evelyn's death had triggered severe depression requiring psychiatric evaluation alongside cardiac treatment for electrical trauma that had nearly killed him during grief that already pushed his mental health beyond normal limits. Mr. Monroe, losing spouse after 48 years, creates psychological trauma that requires professional intervention, explained psychiatrist Dr. Michael Rodriguez during evaluation that revealed Frank's suicidal ideation since Evelyn's death. "Doc, without Evelyn, I got no reason to wake up tomorrow." Frank admitted with honesty that shocked medical staff who'd focused on cardiac damage without recognizing deeper emotional wounds requiring healing. Bradley's assault had endangered veteran whose grief already threatened his survival, creating medical emergency that extended beyond physical trauma into psychological crisis requiring comprehensive intervention that cemetery policies hadn't anticipated. Meanwhile, bureaucratic obstacles prevented Marines from maintaining promised honor guard at Evelyn's grave due to federal regulations requiring permits, supervision, and compliance procedures that prioritized institutional control over emotional support for grieving families. Colonel Harrison, cemetery regulations prohibit unauthorized military ceremonies without proper authorization. Director Williams insisted, despite obvious cruelty of abandoning promise to Frank about protecting Evelyn from darkness she'd feared throughout life. Marines faced choice between following regulations that abandoned their instructor or violating federal procedures to honor commitment that transcended bureaucratic compliance but could result in disciplinary action affecting their careers. Frank's psychiatric evaluation revealed that Bradley's assault had occurred during mental health crisis that required immediate intervention to prevent suicide attempt by elderly veteran whose reason for living had been buried that morning. Representatives, Mr. Monroe's psychiatric condition demonstrates how police assault on grieving veterans can trigger psychological emergencies requiring specialized intervention, testified Dr. Rodriguez during congressional hearing about cemetery security failures. Bradley faced federal prosecution while his personal problems revealed during investigation generated sympathy from some observers who recognized how divorce, custody battles, and financial stress could affect professional judgment without excusing assault on vulnerable veterans. Officer Bradley's personal struggles don't justify tasing elderly veteran during mental health crisis, observed federal prosecutor, but they explain how individual pain can create institutional failures affecting innocent people. Frank's testimony from psychiatric hospital created emotional impact that transcended partisan politics through simple dignity of war hero whose love for deceased wife had been met with electrical violence during vulnerable moment requiring compassion rather than enforcement. Representatives, I survived Vietnam combat, but nearly died from American police officer's taser on day Y buried woman who gave my life meaning. Frank said with quiet strength that highlighted institutional failures enabling veteran mistreatment. Congressional gallery erupted in standing ovation for elderly Marine whose dignity remained intact despite obvious psychological fragility, from grief and electrical trauma that had nearly ended his life during moment requiring human decency rather than bureaucratic compliance. The Frank Monroe Protocol emerged from bipartisan congressional response to veteran mistreatment that required systematic reform rather than individual prosecution, establishing federal protections for grieving military families during cemetery visitations. This legislation honors Frank Monroe's service while preventing future assaults on grieving veterans whose emotional needs require institutional accommodation rather than enforcement actions, President announced during White House signing ceremony. Bradley received federal conviction with suspended sentence contingent on completing counseling for personal problems that had affected professional judgment, serving as example that individual accountability required addressing root causes rather than just punishing symptoms. Derek Bradley's conviction demonstrates that personal struggles don't excuse veteran mistreatment, but effective justice requires helping people address problems that create harmful behavior, observed federal judge during sentencing that emphasized rehabilitation over punishment. Marines successfully negotiated compromise, allowing supervised honor guard rotations at Section 60, ensuring grieving families received emotional support within federal regulations that balanced institutional needs with human compassion. Frank's recovery enabled advocacy for comprehensive veteran mental health services that recognized grief counseling as an essential component of military family support, requiring federal funding rather than individual resources. True justice heals the causes of harm, not just the symptoms, addressing pain that creates violence while protecting those who suffer from it. Frank's return to Arlington Cemetery was marked by permanent Marine Honor Guard, established through Frank Monroe Protocol that balanced federal regulations with institutional recognition of military family emotional needs during profound grief. Gunny, we kept our promise. Evelyn was never alone, Marcus reported while helping Frank from wheelchair to gravesite, where Marines had maintained respectful presence throughout his hospitalization for cardiac and psychiatric treatment. Bradley completed court-ordered counseling while beginning victim advocacy work with veterans experiencing mental health crises, his personal recovery enabling him to recognize warning signs he'd missed in himself and others. Frank, "I failed you when you needed compassion most," Bradley said during a personal meeting that represented healing for both men whose pain had intersected tragically. "My problems became your trauma, and that's unforgivable." Frank's response surprised everyone. "Derek, hurt people. You got help, made amends, found purpose serving others. That's what Marines call adaptive leadership learning from failure to prevent future casualties." Congressional ceremony honoring Frank Monroe Protocol created moment of national healing as President signed legislation that transformed individual tragedy into systematic protection for grieving military families nationwide. Frank Monroe's courage in testifying despite psychiatric trauma from electrical assault demonstrates service commitment that extends beyond military discharge into civilian advocacy for vulnerable veterans, President declared during Rose Garden ceremony. Frank's medal presentation, Congressional Gold Medal for Veteran Advocacy, occurred at Evelyn's gravesite, where Marines maintained honor guard that ensured she participated spiritually in recognition of their shared sacrifice for causes greater than individual comfort. "Evelyn would be proud that our pain created protection for other families," Frank said while placing medal on her headstone. "She always said, 'Love multiplies when shared with those who need hope.'" Implementation of Frank Monroe Protocol faced institutional resistance from security agencies whose training emphasized enforcement over accommodation, requiring comprehensive cultural change that challenged traditional approaches to federal property management. Frank Monroe Protocol creates logistical complications for cemetery operations, testified National Cemetery Administration during oversight hearing. Special provisions for military families require additional staffing and procedures that strain existing resources. Frank's advocacy overcame resistance through partnerships with veteran service organizations whose political influence generated funding for implementation costs while ensuring protocol served intended purposes rather than creating bureaucratic obstacles. Congress appropriated sufficient funding for Frank Monroe Protocol implementation, announced Senate Veterans Affairs Committee Chairman. "Military families deserve accommodation, not excuses about resource limitations." Bradley's transformation from assaulting officer to veteran advocate created redemption narrative that inspired other law enforcement personnel struggling with personal problems affecting professional judgment. Derek Bradley's journey from perpetrator to protector demonstrates that individual healing can create systemic change when people accept responsibility for harm while working to prevent future casualties, observed Police Training Director. His victim advocacy program, funded through Frank Monroe Protocol, provided crisis intervention training for law enforcement, encountering veterans experiencing mental health emergencies during emotionally charged situations. Officer Bradley's program has prevented 47 similar incidents by teaching de-escalation techniques for grieving military families, reported training evaluation after first year of implementation. 2 years later, Frank celebrated second anniversary of Evelyn's death with gratitude rather than grief, understanding that her memory lived through systematic changes that protected other military families from experiencing assault during vulnerable moments. Marines maintained permanent honor guard rotation at Section 60, while Bradley's advocacy program expanded nationally, proving that individual healing could create institutional transformation when people acknowledged pain rather than projecting it onto others. Gunny's courage created change that honors Evelyn's memory through protection for families she never met, observed Colonel Harrison during anniversary ceremony. Love multiplied through service to others facing similar loss. Frank smiled through tears that honored both Evelyn's memory and Marine brotherhood, whose loyalty had transformed personal tragedy into national policy, protecting vulnerable veterans from institutional failures. Derek learned that personal pain can become purpose when channeled toward helping others. Frank reflected, "That's what Evelyn would have wanted, healing that prevents rather than perpetuates suffering." The Frank Monroe Protocol established federal protections for grieving military families while generating $100 million in veteran mental health funding nationwide. Bradley's transformation inspired law enforcement training programs that prevented 200-plus similar incidents through crisis intervention techniques for veterans experiencing emotional trauma. Marine Honor Guard programs expanded to 23 national cemeteries, while Frank's advocacy created comprehensive grief counseling services for military families. Arlington Cemetery implemented permanent policy changes ensuring emotional accommodation rather than bureaucratic enforcement for families facing profound loss, requiring extended visitation beyond standard hours. 5 years later, Frank Monroe Protocol had transformed cemetery operations nationwide while establishing federal oversight, preventing institutional failures that enabled assault on grieving military families. At 77, Frank continued daily visits to Evelyn's grave while mentoring other widowers through grief that required community support rather than individual struggle. Bradley's victim advocacy program became national model, proving that people who cause harm can become agents of healing when they address personal pain rather than projecting it onto others. They learned that some battles you fight for country, others for love, but the most important battles transform personal pain into protection for others who face similar struggles, creating circles of healing that honor both those we've lost and those we're determined to help. Some battles you fight for country, others for love, but the most important battles transform personal pain into protection for others who face similar struggles.